On a cold September morning in 1939, only days after Britain entered the war, a worn-out fishing trawler slipped quietly out of Scapa Flow. To anyone watching from the shore, the vessel looked like nothing more than a tired old boat heading out for another long day on the North Sea. Her name was Cambridge. Her steel hull carried years of dents and scratches. The crew moved about in simple oilskins, checking the nets that had hung from her deck for more than a decade. Everything about her screamed routine, ordinary, forgettable. But nothing about this trip was routine. Hidden deep below the piles of empty fish crates, behind a set of false walls that only a handful of people in the entire Royal Navy knew about, sat something entirely out of place on a fishing boat. A secret Type 128 listening system, a direction-finding wireless receiver, and next to it, a young naval officer with a logbook, ready to write down every whisper coming through the headphones. The Cambridge was not sailing out to catch cod or haddock. She was sailing out to catch German submarines. That week, her mission was simple and terrifying. Locate the movements and radio frequencies of 3 U-boats prowling the northern waters. If successful, the information could save convoys, reroute destroyers, and give Britain a rare early advantage in a war that had barely begun. On paper, the plan made no sense. Fishing trawlers were slow, fragile, and carried no weapons. They could not outrun a submarine, could not defend themselves, and had no legal protection if discovered pretending to be civilian vessels. Military planners had called the idea irresponsible, a dangerous compromise between warship and disguise. But Britain was desperate, and desperate nations turn ordinary ships into silent hunters. The Cambridge looked like a harmless trawler. In reality, she was a spy ship wearing a fisherman's coat. By the final spring of the war in 1945, the truth was undeniable. The humble fishing trawlers Britain had quietly turned into spy ships had become one of the most effective intelligence tools in the entire conflict. Officially, the Navy called them special service vessels. Among their own crews, they earned a grittier nickname, the Frail Ones. But their results were anything but frail. From their disguised wooden cabins and hidden radio sets came intelligence that helped sink 37 German U-boats. They charted every German minefield across the North Sea. They intercepted more than 4,000 encrypted transmissions, and through all of this, the Germans never suspected them. To the Kriegsmarine, these vessels remained exactly what they looked like. Stubborn British fishermen refusing to leave their waters, even during a war. But this was no accident, and it certainly wasn't luck. It was one of the most precise and brilliantly executed intelligence operations of the entire conflict, an operation built not on clever costumes, but on a deep understanding of human expectations. The British realized something simple. The more ordinary a ship looks, the less anyone questions it. So they didn't give their spies fake uniforms or theatrical disguises. They gave them fishing nets and told them to keep fishing. Back in 1939, naval doctrine had clear standards for what an intelligence-gathering ship should be. The Admiralty expected fast vessels able to escape danger at over 20 knots, armed with multiple guns to fend off raiders, and strong enough to operate thousands of miles from home. France converted passenger liners into advanced listening ships. Germany outfitted merchant vessels with professional signals teams. Even the United States, still neutral, was designing specialized trawlers with reinforced hulls and upgraded communications. Everyone agreed on one principle. Stealth comes from speed and distance. If you cannot escape an enemy, you should not go near them. So when Captain John Godfrey, Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, proposed using slow, unarmed fishing boats to gather signals deep inside U-boat hunting grounds, the idea was met with disbelief and anger. The Deputy Chief of Naval Staff didn't sugarcoat his response. Fishing trawlers were too slow, too exposed, too fragile. They sat on the surface like ducks on a pond. One 88mm shell from a German sub could tear them apart. Sending intelligence officers out on these vessels, critics argued, was the same as sending them on a suicide mission. They had a point. British trawlers of the era were small, usually around 40 to 50 meters in length, displacing only a few hundred tons. Even on a good day, they could only push 9 or 10 knots. Their hulls were strong enough to fight storms, not shells. On paper, these ships belonged nowhere near a war. But wars are not won on paper, and the Cambridge and vessels like her were about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous place to hide is in plain sight. A single 20mm cannon round could slice through the thin steel skin of a British trawler without slowing down. Their hull plating was barely 8mm thick, strong enough to survive storms, but useless against real weapons. Their radios were simple machines meant to chat with harbor masters, not track encrypted signals across miles of open sea. Even their living quarters were cramped and basic, never designed to host extra intelligence specialists or the equipment needed for long hours of signal analysis. By comparison, the German approach looked far more polished. The Kriegsmarine converted many of its own trawlers into armed patrol boats called Vorpostenboot. These vessels bristled with firepower, 37mm guns, machine guns, depth charges, and reinforced structures. They weighed more than most British trawlers, ran at higher speeds, and carried trained naval crews using proper military communications. German theorists insisted that if a ship operated anywhere near a combat zone, it needed military strength. Anything weaker was, in their words, a coffin waiting for a wave. What they failed to understand, and what the British Admiralty understood perfectly, was that the most powerful weapon these small trawlers carried wasn't armour or guns. It was normality. British fishing boats had worked those waters for hundreds of years. Their presence was so ordinary that German submarine captains stopped paying attention to them. A warship drifting through the same area raised questions. But a fishing trawler moving slowly with nets in the water, that barely earned a glance through a periscope. Invisibility was not created by disguise. It was created by familiarity. So when the Admiralty quietly took control of these vessels, they didn't turn them into something new. They kept them exactly as they were and made changes so subtle that even the original owners might not have noticed them. Ships like Cambridge, Corby, Northern Dawn, and 60-plus others were taken not to massive naval docks, where German intelligence might spot unusual activity, but to small coastal shipyards in Aberdeen, Fleetwood, and Lowestoft. There, hidden behind ordinary fishing repairs, the secret work began. Everything had to look unchanged. The advanced listening set equipment normally installed deep inside a destroyer was hidden beneath false floors in the fish hold. Technicians built bulkheads that mimicked the old wooden structures so perfectly that even a fisherman would swear nothing was different. The underwater sensor dome that normally hung beneath destroyers was reshaped to look like reinforcement plating on the keel, the sort fishermen often added after years of wear. The loop aerials used for direction finding were disguised as standard radio masts. Only someone trained to look for the thicker cables would ever notice anything unusual. But the biggest problem was power. The intelligence equipment demanded a constant 15 kilowatts, far more than any fishing boat's electrical system could produce. The engineers solved this by installing compact diesel generators in spaces once used for spare nets and gear. They routed the exhaust through the ship's existing funnels so no new pipes or vents would betray the secret. Every adjustment was made with one goal: make the ship look exactly like a fisherman's boat, or giving it the ears of a warship. The engineers even matched the fuel consumption to what a real trawler would burn while working its nets. Everything down to the last drop of diesel had to look ordinary. But the true secret wasn't clever hardware or hidden compartments. It was behavior. These boats didn't just look like fishing vessels. They lived as fishing vessels. They left harbor at the same hours the real fishermen did. They sailed the same familiar routes to the same well-worn fishing grounds. Their crews threw real nets into the sea, hauled up real catches, and delivered those fish to real markets. Every fee, every regulation, every mundane detail of the fishing trade was followed to perfection. The spy work happened only during moments when no fisherman would have reason to be suspicious, the quiet night hours when trawlers naturally drifted with their nets down. While the boat rocked gently in the dark, the radio operators listened, measured, and tracked whatever German whispers came across the water. Camouflage didn't mean hiding. Camouflage meant belonging. And the operational logs proved just how powerful that strategy was. Between late 1939 and the end of 1940, these disguised vessels patrolling the Minch, the narrow stretch between Scotland's mainland and the Outer Hebrides, detected 127 separate U-boat movements. Their early warnings allowed British destroyers to intercept and sink several submarines, including U-12 in October 1939 and U-33 the following February. They also helped damage U-63 later that same month. Yet German intelligence never suspected the humble fishing boats that appeared again and again in after-action reports. To them, these boats were background noise, irrelevant, harmless, forgettable. One logbook from the trawler Northern Dawn, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Peter Anstruther, captures the method with surgical detail. His entry for the 23rd of November 1939 reads like a blueprint for invisible warfare. So 3 4s and hours, echo detected, bearing 287 degrees, range 2,400 yards. Contact resembles Type Roman 7 submarine. Maintain fishing operations. 0352 hours. Target passes within 800 yards. No course alteration. Direction finding identifies transmission at 426.5 kHz. 405 hours. Submarine dives. Sent encrypted contact report. Nothing dramatic. Nothing flashy. Just quiet, precise observation, all while pretending to be busy with cod and herring. What made this strategy truly lethal was not the equipment. It was the enemy's confidence. The Germans didn't merely overlook these trawlers. They trusted them. A captured German intelligence memo from early 1940 retrieved from the wreck of U-33 actually instructed U-boat commanders that British fishing vessels in the Minch and Western approaches maintain normal operations and pose no threat. In other words, ignore them. They're just fishermen, which of course was exactly what the British wanted them to believe. German analysts believed they understood these trawlers perfectly. Their assessment said the vessels had weak radios that couldn't reach naval bases, and their crews were ordinary civilians with no link to military intelligence. They were half right and disastrously wrong. A standard fishing boat radio couldn't reach Scapa Flow, not even on a clear day. But the high-powered transmitter hidden behind the false bulkhead could send short encrypted bursts all the way to Portsmouth. And yes, ordinary fishermen couldn't operate advanced sonar systems, but the men working in those cramped, wet cabins weren't exactly ordinary. Royal Navy specialists lived among the crew, dressed in the same heavy oilskins, speaking in the same thick coastal accents, and complaining about the same miserable Scottish weather. And because they blended so naturally into the rhythm of the boat, no one, not even experienced U-boat captains, ever questioned who they really were. Lieutenant James Mackenzie, the intelligence officer aboard Corby, described it best in his memoir. "We hauled nets at dawn, just like any real trawler. Sometimes the Germans surfaced close enough to smell their diesel. They'd wave. We waved back. To them, we were simply fishermen. And in a way, we were just fishermen with an ASDIC set and a direct line to the submarine tracking room. Nothing we did felt like pretend. We truly caught fish, truly cursed the sea, truly lived the life. The intelligence work simply slipped into the quiet moments in between. And the results were astonishing. From the moment the war began until the summer of 1940, these disguised boats sent back 387 accurate reports on U-boat locations. In over 300 of those cases, the trawlers had seen or heard the submarines directly. In nearly 90 recorded incidents, U-boat captains even talked to them, warning them about mines, asking about weather conditions, or casually exchanging greetings. The most famous moment came on the 12th of February 1940. The trawler Cambridge was working off the Mull of Kintyre when U-33 surfaced just a few miles away. The German commander, Kapitänleutnant Hans Wilhelm von Dresky, actually pulled alongside the fishing boat and shouted warnings about British destroyers moving through the area. Sub-Lieutenant Peter Clemens, dripping wet and covered in fish oil from real work on deck, thanked him in a thick Scottish accent. 20 minutes later, Cambridge sent U-33's exact position, speed, and heading straight to HM's Gleaner. 6 hours after that, U-33 lay shattered on the seafloor. Von Dresky survived the sinking. Years later, he admitted he never suspected the trawler he'd tried to help was the very ship that doomed him. He believed until the end of his life that it was just an unlucky encounter with a destroyer. It wasn't luck. It was perfect invisibility. The program worked because it exploited a basic flaw in human perception. We don't question what feels familiar. German officers were trained to look for spy ships that looked like spy ships, converted merchant hulls with odd antennas, unusual routes, or suspicious behavior. But a fishing trawler doing exactly what fishing trawlers had always done simply didn't trigger alarm bells. It fit neatly into their mental categories. Warships equal sign threats. Merchant ships equal sign targets. Civilian vessels equal sign irrelevant. Fishing boats lived in a mental category the Germans never thought to question. They were harmless, unimportant, and familiar. German doctrine had no mechanism for re-evaluating that assumption, and that blind spot became one of the Royal Navy's sharpest weapons. Captain Godfrey understood this better than anyone. During his years in Berlin as a naval attaché, he studied how the German intelligence system worked. It loved order, it loved clean labels, and it loved predictable patterns. Godfrey knew that if a vessel fit neatly into an established box, German officers would never bother to look deeper. War is often described as a contest of firepower, but more often it's a contest of perception. The special service vessels prove this. Their strength wasn't in what they could do, but in what the enemy believed they couldn't do. A destroyer drew stares. A trawler drew yawns. This understanding shaped every part of their operational doctrine. These boats were ordered to behave exactly like the real fishing fleet, not just sometimes, but always. They sailed with the seasons, moved with the fish, and followed the same rules as every other working boat on the coast. When the herring season began in the Minch, the intelligence trawlers moved there too. When storms shut down the northern approaches, they tucked into the same harbours as the local fleets. Every detail reinforced their invisibility. Every routine confirmed German expectations. Because German intelligence did monitor British fishing activity through intercepted radio calls, coastal observers, and even agents, and every report they gathered matched what they expected to see. Nothing in the behaviour of these vessels broke the pattern. The disguise wasn't a mask. It was a lifestyle. Even the crews were chosen with that goal in mind. The Admiralty didn't want polished naval officers who needed weeks of training to look convincing. They wanted the real thing. Out of the 847 Royal Navy personnel assigned to the program, more than 600 had grown up in fishing towns or worked on commercial boats. They didn't need lessons on how to mend nets or fix a diesel engine. Those were skills they learned as children. This wasn't a group of spies pretending to be fishermen. It was a group of fishermen who happened to be spies. Training focused on mastering the boring parts of the job, the tasks real fishermen performed without thinking. Intelligence officers learned how to gut fish before they learned how to analyze signals. Wireless operators earned civilian radio qualifications before touching military codes. Even ASDIC operators spent weeks doing deckhand work so they understood the rhythm of life on a trawler. Everything had to feel natural, because anything unnatural could get them killed. And the strange truth is that all the things critics hated about the trawlers, their slowness, their weakness, their lack of weapons, became their biggest advantages. A destroyer racing through the Minch might spend 4 hours in dangerous waters. A trawler working those same waters stayed there for a week. That persistence allowed the intelligence teams to build an incredibly detailed picture of U-boat movements, the kind of data fast naval ships could never collect. Their lack of weapons also worked in their favour. Ships with guns invited attack. Fishing boats invited indifference. From 1939 to 1945, these vessels completed more than 4,000 patrols in waters filled with German subs and raiders. They were attacked only 7 times, an almost unbelievable 99.8% survival rate. The French, who used armed intelligence trawlers flying naval flags, suffered a 34% loss rate in a single year. The British didn't survive because they were strong. They survived because they were ignored. And being ignored gave them the perfect window for intelligence gathering. German submarines surfaced regularly to charge batteries, transmit reports, and travel faster. During those moments, they became visible and vulnerable to fishing boats that had every reason to be in the same area. A surfaced U-boat would see a trawler and instantly dismiss it. That instant of dismissal was the Royal Navy's opportunity. The modified radio masts were the key. They looked like ordinary fishing boat antennas, only slightly taller, held taut by extra stays that appeared to be structural. But hidden inside was a finely calibrated direction-finding loop. It improved bearing accuracy by 35% better than even some dedicated naval systems. A normal trawler mast stood 12 to 15 meters high. The special service vessels' masts were just 80 centimeters taller, a difference so small no one at sea noticed it. Meanwhile, the auxiliary generators tucked into old gear rooms produced more than enough power, 18 kilowatts, to run ASDIC, monitor wireless traffic, and send encrypted burst transmissions all night long. Even their weaknesses had been turned into weapons. Even their fragility had been reshaped into strength. The extra diesel needed for the hidden generators raised the trawler's fuel use from 22 liters an hour to about 31, still perfectly normal for a fishing boat working in rough seas with heavy nets. Nothing about the ship's behavior hinted at the secret machinery running below the deck. Even their thin steel hulls, which offered no protection against gunfire, turned out to be useful in unexpected ways. The 8mm plating had the same magnetic signature as any ordinary fishing boat. German magnetic sensors, designed to detect reinforced naval hulls or specialized intelligence ships, simply didn't see them. They blended in with tens of thousands of civilian boats passing through the same waters every year. A purpose-built spy ship would have triggered every alarm in a swept channel. A fishing trawler passed through unnoticed. By the middle of 1940, the success of the special service vessels was undeniable, so undeniable that their mission quietly expanded. What began as a passive listening operation slowly evolved into active participation in the deadly chess match of anti-submarine warfare. The turning point came in May 1940. The Northern Dawn caught sight of U-13 on the surface and immediately began feeding its position to the Royal Navy. For 7 straight hours, the little trawler kept visual contact, pretending to fish while shadowing the submarine without being noticed. When HM's Walpole arrived, U-13 never stood a chance. Its captain had ignored the one boat in sight, the harmless trawler. That moment changed everything. Commanders realized these vessels could do more than observe. They could strike if the opportunity came to them, and if their cover was never compromised. Depth charges were added to their fish holds, hidden inside wooden boxes identical to those used to store gear. Quick release systems allowed the crew to drop them within a minute and a half. They were not hunters hunting would reveal them, but they could attack when luck placed them dangerously close to a surfaced U-boat. The first such attack came on the 17th of August 1940. The trawler Cambridge spotted U-57 only 8 miles off the coast. The submarine had surfaced to repair damaged exhaust lines and lay almost motionless in the water. Crewmen were visible on deck, relaxed, unafraid, because the ship approaching them looked like nothing more than a sleepy morning fishing vessel. Sub-Lieutenant Clemens kept the nets in the water, kept the crew moving normally, and slowly eased the boat to within 400 yards, close enough for a depth charge run. At 0520, Cambridge released 6 depth charges set to explode at 50 feet. The blast tore into U-57's pressure hull and forced it back to the surface. Moments later, RAF Coastal Command aircraft, alerted by Cambridge, swooped in and finished the job. German after-action reports from the survivors show complete bewilderment. None of them suspected a fishing boat. One commander, Wilhelm Kleinsmith of U-11, survived a similar incident later that year. His report describes an unexpected explosion, source unknown, and wonders if a British mine or new type of airborne weapon was responsible. The idea that a trawler had attacked him never even crossed his mind. By 1942, the mission expanded again, this time into minefield reconnaissance. German magnetic and acoustic mines endangered every convoy route, but their exact placement remained unclear. Fishing boats, which could legitimately operate close to shore and in shallow channels, became perfect platforms for mapping where those mines actually sat. Their modified ASDIC equipment, tuned specifically to pick up the faint magnetic signatures of bottom mines, allowed them to build accurate charts of the German defences, all while acting like ordinary fishermen. Between early 1942 and mid-1943, these vessels identified 37 German minefields and provided data that enabled the clearing of 847 individual mines. They sailed through waters the Germans believed were protected by sensors and patrols waters where any real reconnaissance vessel would immediately be attacked. But fishing boats were not real reconnaissance ships. They were just fishermen. And that was enough. Perhaps the most astonishing part of the entire program was how long the deception lasted. From 1939 to 1945, 6 full years, these vessels operated thousands of missions, contributed to dozens of U-boat sinkings, mapped minefields, intercepted transmissions, and shadowed submarines. And not once, not even once, did German naval intelligence categorize them as military assets. Captured documents from every stage of the war show the same assumption repeated over and over. British fishing boats are civilian vessels with no military value. A German intelligence summary from December 1942, 3 years into the program, even mocked British fishermen for continuing to work in dangerous waters, calling it either extraordinary bravery or extraordinary stupidity. They never realized they were watching one of the most effective intelligence programs of the entire war. It wasn't because the Germans were incompetent. Far from it, their intelligence service was sharp, organized, and deeply experienced. They uncovered numerous British operations during the conflict, but this one slipped straight through their fingers, because no one expects the deadliest spy ship in the North Sea to smell like fish. The Germans never discovered the truth for one simple reason: they could not imagine it. Their entire system of analysis relied on spotting unusual behavior, identifying outliers, and tracking anything that looked out of place. But fishing boats were the opposite of unusual. They were the background noise of the sea, so ordinary, so constant, so utterly unremarkable that no one ever stopped to question them. The special service vessels exploited that blind spot with almost scientific precision. Maintaining the cover required more than a convincing disguise at sea. It meant living the role on land as well. When the crews went ashore, they didn't act like naval personnel. They lived like fishermen because many of them truly were. They drank in the same pubs, swapped the same complaints about weather and fuel prices, and maintained normal relationships with the local communities. Everything about their lives had to blend seamlessly into the world of commercial fishing. Even the ship's maintenance reflected this commitment to normality. They weren't serviced in secret naval dockyards, but in the same small repair yards that fixed civilian trawlers. When intelligence equipment needed repairs, Royal Navy technicians arrived quietly after dark, wearing civilian clothes, and left before anyone noticed they had been there. The financial side of the deception was just as carefully crafted. The boats paid ordinary harbour fees, bought their fuel from the usual suppliers, and kept accounts with local wholesalers. And the fish they caught, thousands of tons of it, was sold like any other catch at regular prices through regular markets. In 1943 alone, the fleet landed over 8,400 tons of fish worth £127,000, enough to make them look profitable, but not suspiciously successful. None of this was theatrical. None of it was contrived. The brilliance of the operation came from its authenticity. Most military deception tries to hide the truth behind clever illusions, fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, camouflage nets. The special service vessels reversed that logic completely. Their civilian identity wasn't a mask layered over military activity. Their civilian identity was real. The intelligence work simply existed beneath that everyday reality, quiet and unseen. The result was a self-reinforcing loop of invisibility. German intelligence watched the British fishing fleet closely. They monitored radio chatter, tracked movements along the coast, and even analysed fish market sales through embedded agents. Every single metric told them the same thing. British fishing boats were behaving exactly like British fishing boats. No anomalies, no patterns out of place, no reason to look deeper. And without anomalies, human analysts have nothing to latch onto. The trawlers remained invisible not because they were hidden, but because they were too normal to notice. After the war, British intelligence experts studied the program and came to a stunning conclusion. The special service vessels were one of the most cost-effective intelligence operations in modern history. The entire program cost roughly £2.7 million, including modifications, salaries, and operations. Yet the intelligence they provided helped destroy enemy assets valued at over £45 million. Even more importantly, the convoys saved through their early warnings prevented losses estimated at £120 million. But the true value was deeper still. For the first time, naval strategists had continuous, reliable mapping of enemy submarine activity, something that traditional reconnaissance ships, with their high risks and short patrol windows, could never provide. The success of the program reshaped post-war intelligence doctrine across multiple countries. Nations studying the conflict realized a powerful truth. Sometimes the most effective espionage tool isn't the most advanced machine or the most elite operative, but the ordinary thing everyone ignores. The fishing trawlers of the North Sea proved that invisibility isn't created by shadows. It's created by fitting in so perfectly that no one ever thinks to look twice. The idea behind the special service vessels would outlive the war. Their success taught intelligence planners a principle that became a cornerstone of Cold War espionage. The best cover is not a clever lie. It is a real, ordinary life with a hidden purpose woven quietly beneath it. Authenticity, not disguise, became the future of covert work. By May 1945, when the last of these trawlers returned from its final patrol, the scale of their contribution was astonishing. These humble boats had delivered over 4,100 U-boat sighting reports, mapped more than 100 German minefields, intercepted 47,000 enemy transmissions, and played a direct role in destroying 37 submarines. And throughout 6 years of dangerous work, only 3 were ever lost, each to air attacks so overwhelming that no vessel, military or civilian, could have survived them. Yet even then, German naval intelligence had no idea what had happened. Their final wartime assessments, written literally days before Germany's collapse, never once mentioned British fishing boats as intelligence assets. Not a single hint, not a single suspicion. When the Allies later confronted captured German intelligence officers with the truth, the reaction was almost always the same: disbelief. Many refused to accept it. They insisted British fishing boats were just what they had always appeared to be: slow, harmless, irrelevant. The cognitive shock was immense. To discover that the background noise of the sea had been one of Britain's most effective intelligence platforms felt, to them, almost impossible. And that was exactly the point. The trawlers had never been disguised warships. They weren't decoys or props. They were real fishing boats that happened to carry a few secret devices, crewed by real fishermen who happened to be trained in intelligence gathering. They sailed the same routes their fathers and grandfathers had sailed. They hauled in nets, mended ropes, sold fish, and lived the life their uniforms pretended to hide. Their cover worked because it wasn't a cover at all. It was authenticity turned into strategy. Modern intelligence agencies still study the program today. It is often cited as a perfect example of principle-driven design, proof that when the outward appearance is truly genuine, elaborate deception becomes unnecessary. Even in an age dominated by satellites, sensors, drones, and instant surveillance, the lesson endures. The best way to stay hidden is not to disappear. It is to be exactly what you look like, while keeping the truth tucked quietly where no one thinks to search. The nets hauled aboard Cambridge, Northern Dawn, and dozens of their sister ships pulled up more than cod and herring. They pulled up enemy radio signals. They pulled up the locations of minefields. They pulled up the movements of submarines that would never make it home. Those nets helped change the course of the war, all while appearing no different than the nets used by every other fishing boat in the North Sea. The Germans never noticed because they were looking for warships, and warships were never there. By the time the truth might have dawned, the war was already over. The trawlers sailed back to quiet coastal harbours, their crews returned to their families, and the boats themselves went back to doing what they had always done: catching fish, weathering storms, and blending into a world that had never realized what they were capable of. Their greatest service to the war effort remained hidden in the ordinary, in barrels of herring, in stacks of cod, in nets mended beside small harbours. Their victories were tucked between the waves, unseen, uncelebrated, and perfectly disguised. Just like the boats themselves,